Alrighty, who's ready to learn about the anatomy of bone? So we're going to start here with our microanatomy of bone model. And let's move down and start looking at first the outer tissue layer that's made up of dense irregular connective tissue. And that's going to be the periosteum. So this right here is the periosteum, and it's going to surround an entire, the entire bone. And then from it, we can see these little fibers that enter into the bone, and these are called perforating fibers. All right. And then all of this here is going to be compact bone. We get to the inner portion surrounding the medullary cavity, and we have spongy bone. And so you can see lots of holes in between parts of the bone. And so this is basically in the form of what we call trabecula, all these little plates and bars that surround these little openings, hence being called spongy bone. Now, lining this spongy bone is another connective tissue layer called the endosteum. So the gray on this model here represents the endosteum. So let's now take a look at the functional units of bone. And we can see right here, this series of layers is called an osteon. And that's the functional unit of bone. And we start at the osteon right here in the middle. And this space in the middle is called a central canal. Now, if we look down at a more longitudinal section through an osteon, you can see that through that central canal, you're going to have blood vessels, right? Because we're going to have to bring nutrients to that bone. Surrounding that central canal, you can see layer after layer of bone. And so all of these layers are called concentric lamellae. Okay. We also have remnants of old osteons, and you can still see layers. And so we call those layers interstitial lamellae because they're in between all of these functional osteons. Now, in this osteon, you'll also see between the layers that we have these little spaces. These spaces are called lacunae. And inside of those, you have mature bone cells called osteocytes. What you'll notice about these osteocytes is that they look like little spiders. So we look down here, you can see a little better that those little legs on those osteocytes. And those the legs of the osteocytes, those are actually what we call canaliculi. And so those are extensions of the osteocytes so that it can communicate with other osteocytes. So we'll talk about that when we get to lecture. All right, so we have the central canal, concentric lamellae. Then you have osteocytes that sit inside of little lacuna. The osteocytes have little extensions that look like little spider legs, and those are called canaliculi. We have our interstitial lamellae, the remnants of old osteons. And then you'll notice that we have these layers here. Now, these layers here, they're going to run the entire circumference of a bone. So these layers are called circumferential lamellae. All right, and then I'm going to flip this model around. And now we can see these central canals without the blood vessels in them. And what you'll notice is in between those central canals, you have canals that run kind of perpendicular to them. And so these are called the perforating canals. All right, so central canal, perforating canal. And that is everything you have to know on this microanatomy of the bone model. So let's move on to anatomy of a long bone. All right, so here we have a section through a long bone. So what we're going to find is you have the length of this long bone, and we call that the diaphysis. All right, and then the ends right here and right here, we call the epiphyses. And so this one, if this is actually a section through a femur, this is what would connect to the os coxa, right, your hip bone. So this is closer to the body. So we call this epiphysis the proximal epiphysis, and we call this epiphysis the distal epiphysis. Now, if we take a closer look, we can see all of that compact bone right here. And then we can also see on the inside the spongy bone, like we saw in that model. And so you can see these epiphyses have lots and lots of this spongy bone, whereas in the diaphysis, you don't have the entirety of it filled up because this is the medullary cavity right here. And then on this particular bone, let's see, we can kind of see the remnants of an epiphyseal line right here. And we'll talk about what epiphyseal plates and epiphyseal lines are when we get into talking about bone tissue in lecture. All right, and so that is your anatomy of bone, both the microanatomy of the bone model and our anatomy of a long bone.